All right, welcome everyone. I wanted to let you know we are recording this presentation and we've got a couple more minutes before we're going to start, so we're going to let more people get in here. All right, just about 2 more minutes and then we get to talk about lichens, air plants, and a little bit about ferns. And while you guys are signing in, I have actually put in the chat already some helpful links that I'm going to show. 2 of the links I'm actually going to show near the end of the presentation so you can see how good these resources actually are. And some of the other ones are just good for reading information. So if you look in the chat, if you're not seeing them, let us know and we'll post them again. But there should be 4 different links in the chat sitting there for you. And actually, I can go ahead and put my email in there while we're waiting to start as well. So you'll have that easy to access as well. Sure, repost the links, yeah. All right, I just put them up again. I was hoping it saved them, but I guess it doesn't. So the links are there. Can you guys see them now? Looks good. And you should be able to see my email as well. 1 minute left. All right. 1 more minute, almost done. Wanda.
Yes.
You're not muted.
I'm
It's fine. Just keep looking at the clock, waiting for that minute to roll over. Oh, that's it. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Doherty. I'm the residential horticultural agent here in Lake County. With me today, I also have Wanda Rao, who's going to be helping with the chat. She's going to let me know if any questions pop up while I'm talking, and I'll do my best to answer them. If it's going to come up later in the presentation, I might just say I'll answer that a little bit later. Or if it's part of references that I'm providing, I'll let you know about that as well. So welcome. There is, as I said, the chat feature, and there is a Q&A or question and answer feature that you can use throughout. At the end, we are going to give you a 2-question poll. It's super short. It will take you no time at all to answer them, and we'll I'll have that. Wanda's going to post that for us while we're doing the Q&A section kind of at the end there. So to start off, thank you all for being here, and I'm guessing you've taken a lichen to lichens. Promise that's my one dad joke for today, hopefully. So today we're going to be talking about what's on my tree, a look at lichens, air plants, and ferns. So let's get you working. So what you're going to learn today, we're going to start off with explaining what a lichen actually is, the different types of lichens that we have, a little bit about identification. Most identification actually goes with the resource I'm giving you guys, because it's one of the best online resources for lichen identification I've been able to find. We're going to talk about some air plant facts, a bit about some ferns commonly grown on trees. Mostly we're focusing on one, but I'm going to mention a little bit about some others. And throughout the whole thing, I'm going to give you some fun facts because these are, I mean, I just like anything related to trees are some of my favorite topics. All right, so what exactly is a lichen? So you can see in that background picture, there's an awful lot of stuff that's actually growing on the bark of that tree. And we frequently get people coming in or sending pictures asking what's wrong with their plant. They've got fungus growing all over it. Well, you actually have lichen, and that means there's nothing wrong with your plant. It grows on the outside and doesn't actually cause any harm. So what a lichen is it's this wonderful mathematical equation. Not really, it's not really math, but you basically have a Basidiomycota fungus, and that group, that family of fungus is the ones that produce what you normally think of as mushrooms, plus an Ascomycota fungi that produces cups. And the reason the bowl's there is because the reproductive structure's an ascocarp, and it's shaped like a cup. And then you're going to have a photosynthetic partner as well. It's either an algae or a cyanobacteria, and those together actually make up lichens. So you have this symbiotic relationship going on. So the photosynthetic partner creates sugars, and if it's the photosynthetic partner is a cyanobacteria, it also provides nitrogen. Otherwise, nitrogen is usually acquired from the excrement of animals, most frequently birds. And then the fungal side of things helps to bring in more minerals. It grabs water and it creates this nice little habitat that photosynthetic partner can grow in. So lichens themselves are a really important introductory species or pioneer species when you're talking about new areas. So they're able to come in even before other plants can come into certain areas because they're able to grow on rocks, they're able to grow on soil, and then as they die and decompose, they increase the nutrient level, which then allows other plants to come in. Now, for a very long time, we actually thought, it was actually 150 years, we thought there was one photosynthetic partner that was from the Ascomycota group of fungi, and then the photosynthetic partner of either an algae or a cyanobacteria. But through gene expression done by the University of Montana and Purdue, they actually found out that there is a yeast that lives in the lichen as well, and the yeast is part of the Basidiomycota family. It's one of the few that doesn't produce, you know, your stereotypical mushrooms within that grouping. So it's this really intricate and fascinating symbiosis between all of these to create these organisms that are able to live just independently, and they just grow on things as a place to kind of sit. And some of them you can peel off and they'll still be able to grow if you move them. Some of them you can't separate just because of the way they grow. So this is a microscopic image of what an ascocarp looks like. And this is an ascocarp that's being produced by a type of lichen. So if you can see all of those kind of purple dots in the blue, let me get this. So kind of, you can see here, like these little purple dots. Those are all cells from the photosynthetic partner that then go in with the spores for reproduction later on. So even at the reproductive level, this organism is super complicated. So lichens themselves come in three main forms around Florida that we're going to talk about. The first is crustose lichens. So crustose lichen, you can think of them as being encrusted on the tree to the point that you really can't pull them off. They're pretty tight on that tree. And again, they cause absolutely no harm, and crustose are going to be super tight against whatever they're growing on. Now in this image, you can actually see a few different kind of fungi and even some mosses, and nothing on this tree indicates anything's wrong with the tree. The tree's perfectly healthy, you just have an extra organism growing on the outside. Now, the crustose lichen can produce those ascocarps, and here's an example of a crustose lichen, not the same species because you can see a bit more shape to it, but it has those ascocarps happening. And again, those are the reproductive structures. So the fact that they're shaped like a cup means when it rains, the raindrops will then help splash out the spores, so that's how they can spread through reproduction. So here's another example of a few different kinds of lichens. Now lichens, again, it's not super easy to identify a lichen unless you're literally in the field with a good guide, and there aren't many. I have yet to find a good field guide for lichens. So if any of you happen to know of a good field guide, let me know, because I found some okay field guides, but they're not really great. So here's another image of lichens. This was actually, I was at Epcot over the weekend, and this is one of the trees that they had. I think this was over in Morocco, absolutely covered with different types of lichen. And since it has been raining, they tend to get a bit more green, and there are white varieties, versions as well, but you get that green really perking up when you have that wet season. Now, they're not all green or white. You actually get the Christmas lichen, which is this wonderful like red color. Sometimes it's also called strawberry lichen. Some people call it a blood lichen. There's a lot of common names, but the Latin name stays the same. And this particular one's actually an indicator of good air quality because it doesn't generally grow where there's a ton of pollution. And they do grow in size. So here's the same, not the exact same lichen, but the same species, much smaller. So that can grow, if it's got the right growing conditions, it can keep growing and encompass huge sections of different plants. And if you've ever gotten to go hiking in really old growth forests, that's where you can see like really large sections of lichen growing on different things. So in addition to Crustose, we have another grouping called Foliose. And to remember Foliose, it sort of feels more like leaves. It looks a bit more like leaves. There's texture to it. You can feel it. So I have this little bit of a visual aid here if you're able to see me. So what I'm holding up right now is the a cutting of a trunk of a tree, and you can see lichens growing all over it. And there are a lot of different kinds that are mostly the Crustose kind, but then you can also see Foliose, if you can see that, that it actually does have texture, and I could pull that off if I really wanted to. Okay, got tree bits all over the computer. Okay, so Foliose, those are fun because again, you can feel them. And they also get the ascocarp. So this is a shield lichen. It's in the Parmelia genus. And this is actually completely wrapped around this twig. There are several different almost colonies. Now that structure that you're looking at, that green or the white or the pink, that's actually called a thallus. And that's just what the surface of it's called. So that thallus is wrapped around and just holding onto that twig. And it will hold onto a live twig and it'll stay on a dead twig. It doesn't mind. So another example, it's another shield lichen that you can see here. And you can see how it's got that texture and it's not flat up against the tree like those Crustose ones were. You could peel these off if you really wanted to, but they are not causing any harm to the tree whatsoever. So our next example is going to be our fruticose lichen. Now fruticose lichen are really great because these are one of the ones that can grow just on the dirt all by themselves. So these are reindeer lichen on actually on the floor of a Florida scrub. So these aren't growing on your tree, but they might be growing in your lawn depending on where you live. There is a variety that is actually endangered. So, you know, you can pick them up and you can move them to a different spot if you want them, but don't crush them. They do make an interesting crunchy sound if you accidentally step on them. And the thing here is one of the reasons they're called fruticose is when they do their fruiting. They're not a plant, so they don't fruit. But when they go through reproduction, they create these little red growths that kind of look like berries, and that's where that common name of fruticose came from. The big thing here is that they do have longer, more tubular growing patterns than the other two do. And you can see this on our next slide with the British soldier lichen. Some people also call this matchstick lichen. So this is growing on a trunk of a tree. And you can see that it has much longer thallus structures compared to the flat ones that we were looking at earlier. So if you have a tree that looks anything like this, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So this one has several different kinds of lichen, but it does have a type of foliose lichen growing all over this. And I did actually just last week, Mr. Smith, who's credited for the photo, sent me this asking, you know, is something wrong with this tree? He has all these growths on it. And it's always nice when I can reply back and say, actually, nothing's wrong whatsoever. You have this really amazing organism growing on your tree. You don't have to do anything, just leave it. He was very excited to find out about that. In this, you can also see that there's definitely some crustose, and I would bet there's also Foliose lichen on there as well. It's just, I can't quite see with this particular photo. So here's another example of one more kind of lichen, and this is another kind of fruticose, but on this one, it still gets the asci cups. It doesn't get, or ascocarps. It doesn't get the red growth like the reindeer lichens do, but it's still really cool. This is actually on our fig tree in the Discovery Garden. I saw that out there yesterday, and I always get excited when I see the reproductive structures on lichens, so I tend to take pictures of them quite frequently. But if you're wanting to get a better look at lichens, we actually have quite a few. One of the Christmas lichen pictures I took in our garden as well. So if you're out here and you're wanting to see things, you know, stop by the office and I can tell you where some of the cool ones are. Speaking of something cool about lichens, did you know some of them glow in black light? So if you go out at night with a black light camera, and if you don't have one, you can get them at most pet stores because it's a way to identify if your cat's peed in a location, because that also fluoresces. So not all lichens will actually fluoresce. Some of them do, and then they also will fluoresce in different colors. So I took this picture and the next one out while I had, back when I was teaching college classes, I had a field ecology class out and we had our black light, and this was one of the things we were going to do. And we had one that fluoresced this really amazing shade of orange, but it would never work in a photo. Everybody tried it with their phones, it didn't work. But if you live in an area where you can go out at night, where you know there's a lot of lichen, even if it's just in your backyard, take the black light, see if they fluoresce. It's kind of exciting. And while you're out there, maybe you see some scorpions because they also fluoresce in a black light. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause there before we move on to the air plants and see if there were any questions up to this point. Anybody? All right, I'm taking that as no questions up to this point. So if you were on my presentation last week, we were a bit short and sweet. We'll probably be about the same, mostly because, you know, I value your time just like you do. So we're not going to drone on about everything. And as always, if you want more about the science, let me know. I am happy to give you a botany lesson on anything that you would like. So next up are air plants. So air plants are also known as epiphytes, and epiphytes are plants that will grow kind of near other plants or structures for support, but not use them for anything. And they actually collect all of their nutrient and moisture from the air. So in that sense, lichens are an epiphytic organism as well. Okay. So all of the air plants that we're going to talk about today, and all of the air plants that we have in Florida, the plants that we refer to as air plants, are in the genus Tillandsia. And there's lots of different kind of species. We actually have about 500 different Tillandsia species that we can find throughout the state. And I did find, this is one of the other resources that I'm going to show you later. I found a really nice source on identifying of different bromeliads, because Tillandsias are in the bromeliad family. So here's an example here. Not everyone realizes that these air plants actually do flower. So here's an example of a flowering Tillandsia. And they go to seed and they can reproduce by seed. They're very cool. And I always find it a little interesting how people will go and buy the air plant like in the seashells, because those are really overpriced. Because if you have a large tree in Florida, you probably have a Tillandsia growing on the side of it that you could put in a seashell that you got from the beach for free. So saving you guys money. So if you're growing them at home for these guys, they do require three things: light, air circulation, and an occasional light mist of water. So they like large amounts of diffused light. So they can do shade. They don't want full sun, but they like some diffused light getting to them. They'll grow faster that way. So here's another example. Oops, sorry, that's on the next one. So here's another example of a Tillandsia. You can't quite see the flowers. They're right here. They're a little inconspicuous. And this is actually an example that we have in our tropical shade garden, in our discovery garden, that you can come see in person. So next up we have ball moss. So ball moss is actually a close, well, these are all close relatives to Spanish moss, but ball moss is one that usually grows kind of in tangent with it and is often kind of confused with a young version of Spanish moss. It balls up more, where Spanish moss you can pull apart a bit more. So here's another example, and on it you can see right here another flower stalk that has come off of it, and again, just another ball moss. So next we have crow's nest. This is another one that's in our garden. It's very cool. See how tall it's getting? So we have different habits or different ways that these form their adult growth stages that are really quite cool. All right, so Spanish moss is neither Spanish nor moss. It's actually another type of Tillandsia. It's native to our area. And the natives, when France actually settled, the natives told them what it was called, and it translated into, I just forgot what it translated into. I'm so sorry. But anyway, the French people decided they didn't like that, and they thought it reminded them more of the Spanish conquistadors' beards, and that's where the common name of Spanish moss actually came from. And contrary to popular belief, Spanish moss in trees is not full of chiggers. Chiggers tend to live on the ground and in lower areas, so if the mosses fall on the ground, you have a chance that there could be chiggers in it, but that doesn't mean there are, and if it's growing in the trees, you would not have chiggers in it. Now, this is one of the wonderful things that in early Florida was used as stuffing in different things. So pillows, mattresses, even when we started to build cars, it was still used as a filler for the upholstery in cars. Now, a couple of other things. Most people think that one, this hurts the tree and it causes limb drop, it increases disease. It actually doesn't do any of those. So the amount of weight on a limb from Spanish moss is actually negligible. If you've ever picked up a clump of Spanish moss, there's not an awful lot of weight to it, and tree limbs are very strong, okay? Think about the several 100-pound staghorn fern some people attach to these limbs, or swings that we put on them. They're pretty sturdy. So what Spanish moss can do is they can potentially increase the rate of a failing tree's failure, but they didn't cause the failure in the first place. So a tree could be dying from a number of different things that causes it to reduce the amount of leaves that it has. And then the Spanish moss is blocking the light for those other leaves, causing additional problems. But again, the Spanish moss didn't actually cause the problems, and the tree is already failing in the first place. So you don't need to spend the money or the time removing large amounts of Spanish moss from your tree, because it's not doing it any harm. If aesthetically you want to take it down, that's up to you. It's expensive, but it's not necessarily recommended to spray it with any kind of an herbicide, because you can actually damage your tree as well. And I got this little baby picture of a Tillandsia out in the garden yesterday. And if you notice, there are actually two little insects that tagged along in this picture, with the little red spider right there. And then there's a little beetle right there. So those guys were, it's a little cute moment in nature. So that's the end of Tillandsia. So I'm going to stop and check for questions before we move into ferns. Okay, so we have a comment from Joan from Leon County. She heard that lichens are more likely to grow on plants whose size is not changing, such as a tree trunk that is not getting bigger. Actually, they'll grow anywhere, because they can grow with the trunk. Where you won't see them is on exfoliating bark, so the bark that can peel off and that drops regularly, because anything that starts to grow, it just gets sloughed off later on. But I've seen them on very small crepe myrtle branches up to huge oak branches. Now, the smoother the bark, the more likely you're going to be able to see them, because it's a nice surface for them to grow on. So if you have a severely textured bark, you might not see as many kind of crustose ones. You might see more foliose on those locations. But yeah, they'll grow basically anywhere where it's flat. How does Spanish moss spread? They don't have spores because they are a flowering plant, so they do actually produce seeds. So they have a couple of different ways they can reproduce. If you kind of break the plant up, they're able to just keep growing because they're not rooted in place. So you could peel it apart and grow more. Also, again, they do spread seeds, and if the seeds kind of end up somewhere where it's able to start growing, they'll start growing there. Well, Spanish moss is going to be on most trees in, especially oak trees. I haven't seen research, but there definitely seems to be a much higher proportion of Spanish moss in oak trees, particularly live oaks, compared to other tree species. Ball moss, yeah, you can just pick it off. It's fine. You can take it off by hand, no problem. Let's see, we have another Q&A over here. I'm not aware of any restrictions, Carol, for removing Tillandsia from trees other than if it's not on your property, don't take it. That's my biggest answer there. You don't want to take them from parks, national parks, or other areas. I was actually down in Everglades National Park once talking to a ranger inside, and he said, "Excuse me, I have to go." And he went running outside because people were trying to steal Tillandsia off the side of the tree. So if it's growing on your property, you can pick it off. It's just fine. But again, don't take it from somewhere that you don't have permission to take it. Okay, so we have a question here. There seems to be more Spanish moss now than say 40 or 50 years ago. Is that the case? Ronald, I don't actually have any numbers or research to be able to answer if there has been an increase in Spanish moss. I can say that as we have the issues with climate change and the changes in the chemistry in the atmosphere, the more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more plant growth we do tend to see. So it's possible, but I don't have a definitive answer for you right now. All right, good questions. Anything else before we move on to ferns? We don't have too terrible much left. Like I said, we're going to keep it short.
That was it, Jamie.
That was it? Great. Okay. I think I'm going to make this picture my background on my computer. I think it's adorable. Okay. So next up are, if it's going to move, there it goes, ferns. So we're going to talk about ferns next. Now there is one particular species of ferns that tends to grow on trees more than others, and that is resurrection fern. Resurrection fern is absolutely amazing, and if you're new to Florida and haven't seen it, you probably thought something was all crinkled up dead on your tree if you're lucky enough to have this growing on a tree on your property. So in this picture, you should be able to see we've got the nice bright green foliage, and then you have these brown ones up here. So during dry spells, and it doesn't have to be a long dry spell, it can be just 3 days without rain, the plant's going to shut down and it kind of shrivels up, but they have this amazing ability that the second it rains, they just come back and they're green and lush and amazing. Not all of the plants will come back. So if it's been raining for a few days and you still see some dry, brown, shriveled up things, those died. Take those off then. But you should never remove any of the resurrection fern when it's all in the dry state, because you're not sure what's dead and what's alive at that point. So here are some other pictures. This is as it's kind of drying up and starting to curl in on itself. And then here we have one where most of it's dried out because it hasn't rained in a while. And then Epcot for the win on pictures again. Over the weekend, all the resurrection fern was looking absolutely amazing. And if you're not familiar with where the common name resurrection fern comes from, it comes from that whole, it dies and comes back to life, or at least it appears to, so it's resurrecting itself. And again, look, we can see lichens on this particular image as well. Now, trees, other than resurrection fern, most of the time you don't see true trees having a ton of moss growing on them. It's much more common to see in palms. And if you were at my talk last week as well, you'll know palms are not trees. But palms that have these boot attachments next to the trunk have accumulation of different nutrients in there. So if fern spores get in there, they can sprout. They don't cause any harm either. And if you don't like them, you can just pull them out. Ferns produce millions upon billions of spores. So there's very few that you have to be highly concerned about taking them out there. Now, ferns, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to identify ferns. One of the easier things to do when you're trying to identify ferns is looking at the spore pattern on the back. So all those little brown spots are called sori. Inside the sori are structures called sporangia, and inside those are the actual spores. And if you ever wanted to grow ferns yourself, you need a container you can keep highly moist. Just take one of those leaflets, rub the back of it to get the spores released, and just keep it wet and wait. I've done it with students in the past. We usually use a dissecting microscope to look for the growth because it can take months before you'll actually see anything, but it's possible. All right, and then here's another example of kind of different ways that spores can grow. And at the beginning of the fern section, the picture did also show the way the sori are patterned on the back of resurrection fern. So ferns are super short. I am going to talk about one big thing that you should be worried about if you see on your trees next, but I'm going to check for questions again because I saw my chat just kind of got excited.
Okay. Marilyn says it looked like a fiddlehead fern, the resurrection fern.
Okay, I love that. So the fiddlehead, all ferns produce a fiddlehead. So the fiddlehead is when the frond is usually coming up, but resurrection fern also can make that as it comes down. And the reason it's called fiddlehead is because it looks like the scroll of a violin. So I played the violin for a long time, so I get excited between ferns and fiddleheads, yay. But yes, that is definitely what it looks like. Okay, so I'm clarifying for Wendy. Thanks for coming, Wendy. So she's asking to clarify, all lichens do not damage the host tree in any way. Exactly, lichens cause no problem for a tree. Just like Tillandsia caused no problem for a tree, fern causes no problem for a tree. So there are things, especially, really in particular, if you're new to Florida, those are things that would worry you because that's not stuff that you see up north as much as far as ferns and air plants. But you would have still seen some lichens, but again, not many people teach about lichens. Like I mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of books on them out there right now. But yeah, lichens, no problem whatsoever. You can leave them, not going to cause any harm whatsoever. And if you missed it, Wendy, go out with a black light and shine it on there and see if yours glow. All right. So I'm going to go on to the one big thing that if you see, whether it's a true tree or it's a palm, if you see these, that's a red flag. So that is going to be conchs. Those are the real concern. When you see those fungal fruiting bodies, which are produced by Basidiomycota fungi, you don't like these. So this is actually a Ganoderma, and I have another visual aid here, if you can see it. This is an example of a conch that was taken off of a tree that was dying. They're a sign of rot in the tree. So if you have fungal growth happening, that's very bad. There is also a type of saprot fungi that looks similar to lichen, but if you see, so if you're looking up at your tree and you're looking at the bottom of the branch and you see a very large section that's just white on the bottom of a branch, you might want to have a professional come out and look at it to make sure it's not saprot and that it is just a lichen, but you don't normally see thick lichen on the bottom of a branch, so that can be a bit of a red flag as well. So I've got a couple more pictures of different kinds of conchs. If you have dead branches in your tree, you do want to remove them because if they start rotting and attract fungi, that can spread into the living tree, which is not good. All right, and then we have yet another example. So this is what this particular, I'm showing, if you're not looking, you don't have to look at me, but if you aren't, I'm showing something else. This is what this would have looked like. So this area here would have been just attached to that tree. And then you can see this is interesting because it's got two different conchs coming out of it. So that brings us to the end. Here's some resources. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take down my PowerPoint for a second to show you those resources and then come back for questions, okay? All right, so you should be able to see my web browser now. So one of the resources I gave you gives you a link to this lichens page. And it's, like I said, the best lichen identification thing I've been able to find. And I've been looking for years. And there's like huge books you can get. There's like things you can print out from different schools, but there's not like a good book that you can take out with you. And as I said, it's really helpful to have the book with you so you can say, oh, wait, which one is this based on really small changes in characteristics. So I'm just going to scroll through this so you can get an idea, and you guys can go to this on your own later. But you can see how many different lichens, and this isn't even all inclusive, but it's a nice list going on here. Okay, and then the other one is a website with the Florida bromeliads. Now this one's nice because you can actually click on, I'm going to scroll down to find a Tillandsia, so you can click on it, and it's going to take you to a page with even more information. So this is an absolutely wonderful resource for you guys to have as well. So we're going to go back over here. All right, so that brings us to the end. Do you guys have any questions? And while we're looking at questions, Wanda's going to go ahead and throw the poll up, and you guys can answer those 2 questions as we wrap up here. Okay, so if you have a conch on a branch, you definitely want to remove the whole branch because fungi grow based on these structures called hyphae. And when you talk about them in conglomerate, they're called mycelium. It looks a bit like pulled cotton or like a spider's web. That's the main structure of the plant. When you see a conch or a mushroom, that's just the reproductive body. So the real problem is underground, or it's in the actual tree or branch. So if you have something on a branch, you do want to make sure you get that whole branch removed at the proper location. You want to make sure it's at that branch bark attachment so the tree can hopefully heal. If you see it on the trunk of your tree, you likely need to remove it, but call a certified arborist. Go to treesaregood.org, use their find an arborist function, and you can get a professional to come out and look at it and kind of give you a recommendation. Now, on that find an arborist site, you can sometimes find people that do tree work or people that are consultants. For this case, you could just get a consultant out first to find out what you need to do before you hire somebody to do more work. Let's see. Marilyn, there are some fiddleheads that you can eat. I haven't ever harvested, collected, or eaten fiddleheads, so I'm not going to give advice on which ones are good and which ones aren't. But if you're interested in that, there is information that you can gather to actually do that. I have a tree snag that has been developing conchs. Is it dangerous? Well, if you have a tree snag, that means that it's already dead, Barbara, right? So it depends. If it's dangerous, it depends. So if you live in an area where you can leave the snag there as a habitat for different organisms, that's fine. But if you look at it and if it was to fall and it has the chance of hurting property or people, really people or property, then that's what makes it a hazard. So it's not a hazard unless it's going to impact something or someone. And if you want to email me photos, let me know. But I can't really tell for sure how dangerous the situation is or if it's really dangerous without looking. But snags are good for habitat for different things, like woodpeckers like them. You know, sometimes you'll get bees and wasps living in them as well. Bats, owls, there's a lot of things that do like snags. Aw, thank you, Carrie. Yeah, if the tree's already dead and you left it for wildlife, again, as long as it's cut low enough that if it falls, it's not going to cause a problem, you can completely leave it. Yeah, I apologize, guys. The second question on that poll doesn't really work great with this class, just because there's not really the one thing. If you're looking at question 2 going, what on earth can I adapt from this class? What you can adapt is not taking down the tree just because it has lichens, or not trying to remove things because you thought they caused harm and now you know they don't. All right, so going over to Q&A. Well, staghorn ferns, you don't really get them established on the tree directly. Usually people put them in baskets and then attach the basket to the tree, Paul. And when you're attaching the basket, you just want to make sure you have a nice wide strap going over the branch, because something thin can actually cut into the branch as it grows, because the tree is going to keep growing outward, but the weight's going to pull that down. So you want a nice wide strap to not cause problems. And you do want to kind of rotate it around and move it so it doesn't cause structural problems for one particular branch. Oh yeah, I can put the source page back, sure. Let me go put the source page back on. Hang on, I just gotta close some stuff so I can get to it. There's your source page again. So Marilyn asks, what is a snag? A snag is when you have a standing dead tree. So usually there's not oftentimes branches left, so it's like a broken tree. Sometimes arborists will also refer to a snag as a dead branch on a tree, and that's just a problem we have with mixing up our terminology sometimes. I did send out the links. Let me see if they're still there. I think there's the links again.
They're at the very top of the chat box.
Well, I just put them in again because I've got the chat box open again. Thank you, Barbara. I try to keep my everything succinct and not extra fluffy. Let's see. I've done that one. You could potentially get staghorn ferns to root in the bark, Paul, but again, as they grow and get weight, they could potentially harm the tree by kind of ripping the bark down, because they can get very, very heavy. So if you do decide to attach them to the tree, you can kind of use just loose wire to hold them there until they're established, but you will have to make sure you monitor and kind of pull off babies as it comes so it doesn't get so big that it actually causes problems. One other thing I'm going to go ahead and mention about things like putting staghorns on the tree, or having anything kind of growing up on your tree, it hides things like conchs or other signs that something's wrong with your tree. So just really think about it as far as a safety perspective. Do you really want to put vines or staghorns on? And staghorn maybe not as much for hiding conchs, but anything that's covering your trunk makes it harder for you or a professional to come and see what or if something's wrong with your plant. Oh, how do you establish resurrection tree on the fern? My mom has been trying to do this for years. I'm not gonna lie. My mom's one of those people that steals things from, okay, I'm gonna stop talking about that now. But she likes to take cuttings from places she may or may not supposed to be doing that. So she's tried to collect resurrection fern from places over the years. You know, I have told her not to do it as well, just so you know. So she's tried to collect resurrection fern and establish it on her trees, and it actually isn't as easy as you would think, because the resurrection fern likes the humidity and the climate for where it's growing. But then one day she had resurrection fern show up in one of her potted plants, and she's ecstatic. So you could always buy some resurrection fern and see if you can get it established, but do not move it from one location to the next, because it's not likely to actually establish for you. Because the resurrection fern is not an epiphyte, so it does need to have a tree that does have a little bit of kind of soil and nutrients that are accumulating in different locations. So you're not going to see resurrection fern on a smooth bark tree. You're going to see those more on that kind of textured bark tree where little things can kind of get in the nooks and crannies and can actually hold on. All right. Any other questions? Looks like I've got 2 more over in the chat, perhaps. Go mom. I love my mom. She's awesome. There's fun stories about me and her and plants growing up. How about moss growing on trees? Moss growing on trees, like true moss, is not bad either. They don't get true roots at all because they don't have vascular tissue. So they have a very narrow section that's actually attaching and really holding on to kind of dirt that's there and moisture. So it's another thing that doesn't harm trees at all. And you can also grow mosses from spores if you want to. You can email me, I'll tell you how. It's another one that can take a long time, but I think it's fun. I love mosses. Mosses are great. All right, well, that's all I have for you guys. Thank you guys so much for coming. We do have, before all of you go, we do have a new series, Growing Your Garden. They are they're a class series with a small fee for each class, but each class you do get plants relevant to that class. Next week, I think next week, correct me if I'm wrong, Wanda, but it's bromeliads next week. And I think you get 2 bromeliads with, I should know, I'm the one that decided how many plants, but I'm pretty sure it's 2 bromeliads that you get with that particular class. And that one's going to be Tuesday at 1 p.m.
1 gallon bromeliads. Yes.
Yep. Cool. So thank you guys. And then, you know, if you want the link to our registration, we can get that to you guys. We have several different classes. We have the bromeliads coming up. We have succulents. We have pollinator plants. We have native plants, and we have perennials. Also, one more Growing Together from a Distance class for this series next week about strawberries by Juanita Pompano. So thank you guys so much. You have a great Labor Day weekend and stay out of trouble.